Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, sir.
Good afternoon, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the good chairman of the Education Committee, our ranking member, and Representative Kupchak for their hard work, due diligence in bringing forward this very important and critical piece of legislation before us. And I sincerely hope that it moves forward through all the chambers. Through you, Mr. Speaker, just a few questions for clarification to the good chairman of the Education Committee.
Please proceed, sir.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, if a student is capable of self-administering the epinephrine, would anything in this legislation prevent that from happening? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Fleischman.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, no.
Representative Srinivasan.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, so if the child is not capable of administering the epinephrine, as the good chairman mentioned earlier in his dialogue with the Representative Zibran, because of the age and the child cannot administer, that would be the indication where the bus driver, he or she, would then administer the epinephrine. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Fleischman.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, yes. And in addition, as my colleague knows better than I, if a child has entered a state of anaphylactic shock before they can access their EpiPen, they are probably not personally able to self-administer, and at that point as well, we would hope a trained bus driver would step in. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Srinivasan.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, nothing in the language of the bill requires or mandates the buses to carry epinephrine with them. It is only the epinephrine that is carried either by the student that has to be administered, self-administered, or by the bus driver. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Fleischman.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, that is correct.
Representative Srinivasan.
And through you, Mr. Speaker, my final question is, as I'm sure the good chairman is aware of, and all of us are, that administration of epinephrine is just the first step in the treatment of anaphylaxis. And just because the epinephrine is administered does not necessarily mean that the anaphylaxis has been corrected and the child is out of danger. So through you, Mr. Speaker, is there the next step, if it were needed, which obviously would be calling 911, transporting the child to the closest emergency room, would that all be included as part of administration of epinephrine, and that the bus driver not lulled into this false security that epinephrine is being administered, I can continue to drive the bus and continue what he or she does on a daily routine. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Fleischman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my good colleague and physician for his very thoughtful question. As a matter of fact, the training that would be provided to bus drivers under this bill is very clear about the fact that after administering epinephrine, the next step for that driver or any person is to call 911, because as the good doctor has observed, that is just the first step that gets a child out of immediate danger, but not necessarily out of long-term danger. So I would expect any driver or frankly, any individual who has received the training would understand that epinephrine administration comes first, followed by calling of 911 and monitoring of the patient until the EMTs and ambulance are there to take said young person to a hospital where they receive all the further steps that would be appropriate for a child who has suffered anaphylactic shock. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Srinivasan.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the good chairman for his answers, and I hope the chamber will move this legislation forward. Through you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, sir.